Breaking news! Some pissed off Canadians are dumping buckets and buckets of maple syrup into a retention pond at the Clabber Girl factory in Terre Haute, Indiana. More on this developing story at 11. Yes, we have some very, let's say, differing stories from both sides of North America. We've got a very positive story coming out of Mexico with Pato O'Ward, the Indy Lights champion, getting a ride. Justice for Pato, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this video. But to start the video, as I may have teased a little bit there with the funny intro, Canadians, and particularly Canadians that like IndyCar racing, are a little bit hot under the collar, and they have been for about 24 hours as their particular TV deal was announced. And it wasn't really much of a TV deal at all. Let me explain. So, IndyCar will be seen in Canada exclusively through streaming. So essentially NBC Gold, but for the races as well. This is done through Sportsnet. Now here's the kicker. The St. Petersburg race will not be seen at all on any avenue legally in Canada. Oh boy. Oh no. What a tragedy. What an absolute tragedy. And by the way, it's worth noting that IndyCar values Canada so much, or at least seemed to at one point, that the only international race on the calendar happens to take place in Canada. And oh, by the way, the Canadian deal is pretty bad. The Australian deal is almost as bad as the Canadian deal. And I'd like to point out that not only is the defending Indy 500 champion from there and one of the most successful drivers in the series, but aren't they trying to get a race going in Australia, or reboot a race that was gone for a while, and they can't get a good TV deal? Not good. So I'm going to try to explain this situation as best I can, and you Canadians are going to have to help me out filling in the blanks down in the comment section, because it's hard for me to talk about these TV deals. I kind of had this problem as well with this describing the Sky Sports deal, is because unless you live in the country or are very well versed or have talked to the right people, it's very hard to understand how Sportsnet works, or Sky Sports, or BT Sport, or Eurosport, versus something I can talk pretty easily about, like NBC Sports Network or ABC, simply because I live in the United States and those are the options available to me. So this is how I can explain what has happened and how we got to the point where Canadian fans are going to have to pay, depending on your Sportsnet package, apparently, upwards of $200 and as little as $20 to watch IndyCar next year. And again, I need to stress that at this point, there's zero way for a Canadian to watch St. Petersburg legally. So, the international TV deals were worked out up until the end of last year between IndyCar and a third party, ESPN International. Now, of course, we know that IndyCar got out of bed with ESPN domestically last year. Well, apparently they also wanted to get out of bed with them internationally. So IndyCar took their TV rights deals in-house, meaning it was up to IndyCar to negotiate their own TV packages with individual international countries. There have obviously been a couple of home runs, particularly the one at Sky Sports F1, which I think is a big-time get for IndyCar. I mentioned that in the last video. But then you have countries like Australia and a few other ones where the TV deal isn't nearly as strong. And Canada is certainly probably the most egregious for several reasons that I've mentioned previous. It's the one international race that IndyCar has, and quite frankly, at one point, Canada and Canadian racing fans pretty much propped up the Champ Car World Series. They had 3 events there, and they were the three of the most highly attended races of that calendar. So clearly, there's a lot of American open wheel racing fans in Canada. So, how did it go from last year, the deal being negotiated through ESPN International? Races were broadcast on Sportsnet, on the TV, for Canadian fans to watch. This year, same provider, Sportsnet, but now the races aren't available on TV. Well, according to one of the Canadian reporters, and the guy who's kind of been up on this, I don't remember his name. He's an older gentleman, but he's been really kind of fighting the good fight in terms of talking about exactly where this screw up happened. So apparently IndyCar didn't do the best job of negotiating. They thought that Sportsnet would be all in to bring IndyCar back in to their programming lineup for this year. So apparently they didn't even talk to other alternatives like TSN, which is essentially ESPN, but in Canada it's a little bit tough to understand. Again, that's another thing where the American brain doesn't understand Canadian things. Apologies to those I may have offended with that one. But so IndyCar was gung-ho. They were going with Sportsnet. Well, as it turned out, Sportsnet decided to be a little bit more hard-nosed in their negotiations than IndyCar anticipated, or could have anticipated. So, unfortunately, IndyCar didn't have a whole lot of leverage. They didn't have a very attractive product, apparently, to Sportsnet. And you've ended up with this, where IndyCar racing for Canadians is available on a streaming service rather than on television. But it's not a streaming service like NBC Gold where it's exclusively IndyCar. I think you have to pay for a bunch of other stuff, hence why there's a $200 price range floating around out there. It's all a bit confusing, but this is an absolute big-time failure on IndyCar's part. I mean, I actually got to, I'm going to let you in a little preview teaser. I was on a podcast yesterday, the Rain Race podcast. I was a guest on there, and the other guest was Adam Stern. So it was nice to get to talk to Adam Stern, and one of the things we got to discuss, and I was glad I actually was on that podcast with him because I was able to ask him these kind of questions, was like, you know, what's the end goal for IndyCar here? What are they doing if it doesn't look like they can handle this right away? You know, is it about the money? And really, Adam told me that it's more about IndyCar wanting control over their broadcasting rights rather than an immediate change in cash flow or getting rid of a middleman. You know, it's almost like you should have kept the middleman because this is a country that's very important to IndyCar racing. Really, at this point, it's important to IndyCar's heritage. God only knows what's going to happen to the Toronto event now. I mean, if you've pissed the Canadian fans off this much, are they going to be willing to buy tickets to your show? I don't know. There's a lot of questions to be answered, and hopefully some of you Canadian fans can answer those in the comments section. I'm going to guess many of you clicked because of the thumbnail I'm planning to use for this video. So if you haven't let me know already and let the rest of the audience, the rest of the world know your plight with IndyCar, now's your chance. Open it up. And the second, much more positive story today is that, yes, the Indy Lights champion, Pato O'Ward, does have a ride for this year's IndyCar series. Now, it's a partial season schedule. O'Ward will contest 12 events, 13 races for Carlin Racing, and he will start immediately following the St. Petersburg race at Circuit of the Americas. The car number will be 23, and he'll be filling out the rest of the calendar that was originally slated but unable to be filled by Charlie Kimball. So the races Kimball will be at, if you weren't already aware, are St. Petersburg this week. Then he'll take a break and come back for the Indianapolis 500. Then he'll go to Texas. Then he'll go to Pocono. And then he'll finish out the season at Laguna Seca. Every other race Pato O'Ward will race at, including the Indianapolis 500, where he will fill the third Carlin Racing seat. And we're just under the assumption, especially because there was a car that tested with R.C. Anderson in it, with number 31. So I'm guessing that Pato O'Ward will be driving car number 31 at this year's Indianapolis 500. And that also means we've got the third Carlin car confirmed. And that means I think the total now of absolute confirmed entries for this year's 500 is at 32. Obviously, we're expecting somewhere in the range of 37, 38, 39. And we'll just have to see where that all ends up going. Of course, if you watch the Bandwagoner's Guide, you would know this. Thankfully, I got the award information in there and right. We also got a question about R.C. Anderson. Who knows what's going to happen with him? I think Juncos might be the place he ends up landing, but we'll see. Depends on his sponsorship and whether or not the government decides it's legal. O'Ward, Patricio O'Ward, justice has finally been served to Pato, and I think it's fantastic. I think O'Ward is one of those guys who, he reminds me of a Zanardi, he reminds me of a Rossi, he reminds me of a Michael Andretti, the kind of driver who's very, very, very quick. He can get in a car, go fast, immediately pick up that pace, and I think he's a generational talent. I think had he not had a schedule like this where he's going to contest most of the races and most of the important ones outside of the ones that Kimball and his sponsor already kind of poached early on, it would have been a great loss to the sport if he hadn't been able to develop this way. A lot of people were skeptical on Pato rejecting an offer from Michael Andretti to race with the Andretti Autosport team for 8 races this season. And while I think those concerns are a legitimate one, especially considering that at the moment it looks like Andretti is still a higher tier team than Carlin, if you think about it, from a business perspective, Mike Harding, who apparently there's been some non-disclosure agreements signed, but if you read between the lines, apparently the disagreement really was between O'Ward and Mike Harding. So apparently Harding would have been involved in some way, obviously because they're supplying the dampers to hurt his team, but they would have been involved in some way, and O'Ward didn't want any part of that, and I guess more power to him. Here's the thing. And it's something I mentioned in the Alonso video. Remember, Jim Aiello of the Indy Star reported, and I don't think we've quite had confirmation from McLaren on this yet, but McLaren is going to partner with Carlin Racing as a technical alliance. So their tech and feedback, and I would assume the drivers are all going to convene to try to get all their cars faster. That, of course, means that now you're looking at a 4-car team that was originally looking like it was going to be R.C. Anderson along with Chilton, Kimball, and then Alonso kind of playing the 4th guy coming in there. Now the team looks a little bit different, and it looks a little bit more exciting, and quite frankly, it looks more like an Andretti team now because of the 2 drivers that have kind of come in last minute. You now have Kimball, Chilton, O'Ward, and Alonso. Alonso and O'Ward is an interesting one because, of course, we knew that there was a potential that McLaren was going to take over the Harding Racing team rather than Steinbrenner. Well, it turned out that McLaren wasn't willing to or wasn't ready to come up to IndyCar yet, and there was also a little bit of talk about whether or not they could get a Honda engine, and Steinbrenner certainly could. So we kind of have a situation where there was kind of the fantasy of the McLaren team happening last year with O'Ward and Alonso, and now we get a Carlin team that has O'Ward and Alonso on it halfway. It's also kind of halfway a McLaren team with O'Ward and Alonso, so we kind of got it anyway. That's a combination that I think is going to be really interesting, and it's worth noting that while yes they both speak English, they both do also share a common native tongue, I guess you could say. Even though one is a Mexican and one is a Spaniard, they both speak Spanish. And you've got to imagine that would be an advantage in terms of debriefing, because if there's something that may be unclear in English, they might be able to explain it more clearly in Spanish. So that could be an advantage that not a lot of people are thinking about right now. I don't know. I'm not multilingual. I have a little bit of French, un peu, so to speak, but that's about it. I don't know. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Obviously, you've probably already let me know them about the Canadian deal, but also about Pato O'Ward, because I know a lot of people wanted justice for Pato, and it appears Pato got some justice. So thank you guys so much for watching. This has been David Land on YouTube. We'll see you in the next video. Subscribe for more IndyCar and motorsport content.